I've always been into hiking. It's just one of those things that helps me clear my mind, you know? Being out there, away from everything, just the sound of your footsteps and nature all around. It makes you forget about all the stuff going on in your life. Anyway, this one time I decided to try a new trail that I found online. It wasn't too far from where I lived, just a couple of hours drive. The reviews said it was a bit off the beaten path, which was exactly what I was looking for. Some peace and quiet. So I got up early, packed my bag with the essentials, water, some snacks, my phone, and a small first aid kit just in case. The drive out there was nice, with the sun just starting to rise, casting this orange glow over the horizon. I was feeling pretty good about the whole thing. When I got to the trailhead, it was empty. No other cars, no people, just me in the woods. Perfect, right? I started down the trail, and it was beautiful. The path was well marked at the beginning, lined with tall pine trees and the smell of fresh earth all around. There was a light breeze, just enough to rustle the leaves and keep things cool. It felt good to be out there, like I was the only person in the world for a little while. After about an hour, the trail started to change. It wasn't as well maintained as the beginning. The path was narrower, and there were a lot more rocks and roots to watch out for. But I didn't mind. I was there for the adventure, after all. Plus, it made me feel like I was getting deeper into nature, away from all the usual hiking spots crowded with people. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No more birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just silence. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes the forest just gets quiet, right? I kept walking, enjoying the solitude, but after a while, I started to feel this weird sensation, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I shook it off and kept moving, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I came across something odd. There was this old rusted gate off to the side of the trail, half buried in the underbrush. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I went over to check it out. There was no sign or anything, just the gate and what looked like an overgrown path leading further into the woods. Now, any sensible person would probably turn back at this point, but I was feeling adventurous. I mean, who knows what kind of cool stuff you could find off the main trail, right? So, I squeezed through the gap in the gate and started down this hidden path. The air was different there, heavier somehow. The trees were closer together, and the light barely made it through the canopy. It was like stepping into another world. I kept going, my excitement mixed with a growing sense of unease. The path wound deeper into the forest, twisting and turning, until I couldn't see the main trail anymore. After a while, I stumbled upon this clearing. In the middle of it was an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for decades, with moss and vines creeping up the walls. The windows were broken, and the door was hanging off its hinges. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it. It was creepy, sure, but also kind of fascinating. I mean, how often do you come across something like this in the middle of nowhere? I decided to take a closer look. I walked up to the cabin, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. When I got to the door, I hesitated. There was this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I was about to do something I shouldn't, but I pushed the door open anyway and stepped inside. The inside was just as run down as the outside. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and there was this musty smell, like the place had been closed up for a long time. There were some old pieces of furniture scattered around, a broken chair, a table with one leg missing. In the corner, there was a pile of old newspapers, yellowed with age. I walked over and picked one up, just out of the curiosity. The date on it was from the 1980s. As I was standing there, looking at the newspaper, I heard something, a faint creaking sound, like the sound of a floorboard under pressure. I froze, listening. There it was again, coming from somewhere in the cabin. My heart started pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably just the building settling, or maybe an animal that had gotten in, but still, it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I decided it was time to leave. I put the newspaper back and headed for the door, but as I turned to leave, I heard another noise, a whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It sounded like it was coming from behind me, from deeper inside the cabin. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows, but I didn't see anything, just darkness and the shapes of old furniture. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Every instinct was telling me to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness. Then I heard it again. The whisper, this time a little louder. It was like someone was trying to speak but couldn't quite make the words out. My skin started to crawl. Finally, I snapped out of it. I turned and bolted for the door, not looking back. I ran out into the clearing, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was back on the main trail, and even then I kept moving, walking as fast as I could. I wanted to put as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone following me, but there was nothing there, just the empty trail and the trees. I felt a little better as I got further away, but that feeling of being watched never really went away. After what felt like forever, I finally made it back to the trailhead. I was out of breath and covered in sweat, but I didn't care. I jumped into my car and drove off, without looking back. The whole way home, I couldn't stop thinking about that cabin and the whispers I heard inside. I still don't know what it was, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it was enough to keep me from hiking alone for a long time after that. It's been a few months since that day, and I haven't been back to that trail, or any trail for that matter. Every time I think about going hiking again, I remember that cabin and the feeling I had when I was in there, like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. Maybe it was just an old abandoned cabin, and maybe the noises were just the wind or some animal. But there's a part of me that thinks it was something else, something I can't explain. And that's what scares me the most, the not knowing. I guess some things are better left alone, some paths better left untraveled. I've always enjoyed hiking, just the simplicity of it. Walking in nature, away from everything. I usually go with friends, but sometimes I like to go alone. It's like my way of clearing my head, getting away from the noise and stress of daily life. So there was this one weekend when I had nothing planned, and I decided to go for a solo hike on a trail I'd read about online. It wasn't too far from the city, maybe a 2-hour drive, and it was supposed to be pretty quiet, not a lot of people. The drive there was nice, mostly empty roads, cutting through fields and patches of forest. The trailhead was at the edge of a state park, a place that didn't get much traffic. When I got there, I was a bit surprised to see that the parking lot was almost empty, just one other car there. Perfect, I thought. I was looking forward to some solitude. I got my backpack out, made sure I had enough water, snacks, and a first aid kit. The usual stuff. The weather was great, sunny but not too hot, with a light breeze. Ideal for hiking. The trail started off pretty easy, just a dirt path winding through the trees. Birds were chirping, and you could hear the rustle of leaves from squirrels or whatever small animals were moving around. I felt good, like this was exactly what I needed. About an hour into the hike, I noticed that the trail started to get narrower, like it wasn't used much. The trees were growing closer together, and it was getting a bit darker, with the canopy above blocking out the sun. I didn't think much of it at first. I kind of liked the idea of going off the beaten path, seeing something less traveled. The trail was still visible, just less obvious. As I went further, I started to notice that the sounds of the forest were changing. The birds were quieter, and there was this strange stillness in the air. It wasn't silent exactly, but the usual forest noises were subdued, almost like something was holding its breath. It's hard to explain, but it made me feel uneasy, like I was being watched. I kept walking though. What else was I gonna do? Turn back? I wasn't lost, not yet anyway. The trail was still there, even if it was just a thin line of dirt now. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overthinking it, but that feeling of being watched didn't go away. Then I came to a fork in the trail. There were no signs, just two paths splitting off in different directions. I stood there for a minute, trying to decide which way to go. The path to the left seemed more worn, like it had been used more recently, while the right one was almost overgrown. Normally, I would have taken the left path without a second thought, but for some reason, I felt drawn to the right. It was like a little voice in my head was saying, "Go this way." So, I did. The path was rough, with branches and roots sticking up, making it hard to walk. I had to watch my step to avoid tripping, and the trees were so close together that I had to push through some of the branches. It was definitely not a well-traveled trail. After about 20 minutes, I started to wonder if I should turn back. The path was getting harder to follow, and I hadn't seen any trail markers in a while. But then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. It looked like something out of a horror movie. The wood was old and weathered, the roof sagging in the middle, and the windows were dark and dirty. There was no reason for a cabin to be out here, not this far off the main trail. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I should have turned around right then, but my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what was inside, to figure out why it was there. So, I walked up to the cabin, my footsteps crunching on the leaves and twigs scattered on the ground. The door was slightly ajar, just enough that I could push it open with a light nudge. Inside, it was dark and musty, with that unmistakable smell of damp wood and decay. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it around. The cabin was empty, except for an old, rusted bed frame in one corner and a small wooden table in the center of the room. On the table, there was a single object, a small metal box. I walked over and picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and when I shook it, I heard something rattling inside. I tried to open it, but it was locked. There was a tiny keyhole on the front, but no key in sight. I set it back down on the table and looked around the cabin for anything else, but there was nothing, just dust and cobwebs. I was about to leave when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from outside the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was getting closer, like something was moving through the underbrush toward the cabin. I turned off my flashlight and stood there in the darkness, holding my breath. The shuffling stopped, but then I heard a low, raspy breathing, like someone or something was just outside the door. I waited, not daring to move, my eyes locked on the doorway. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then, slowly, it started to move away, fading into the forest. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, and turned the flashlight back on. I needed to get out of there, but part of me wanted to know what was in that box. I grabbed it off the table and shoved it into my backpack, figuring I could figure it out later. I slowly opened the door, peering out into the forest. There was no sign of whatever had been out there, but I didn't want to stick around to find out if it would come back. I stepped outside and started walking back the way I had come, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The forest felt different now, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, and every sound made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the stillness and the darkening shadows as the sun started to set. After what felt like hours, I made it back to the fork in the trail. I took the left path this time, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. I was moving fast now, almost jogging, just wanting to get out of there, but the forest seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, making me second guess every step. I came to a stop when I saw something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the trail. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely a person, just standing there, not moving. My first thought was to call out, to see if they were lost too, but something stopped me. There was something wrong about the way they were standing, too still, too rigid. I took a step back, trying to be as quiet as possible, and that's when they moved. They turned and walked off the trail into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I turned and ran, not caring about the path or where I was going, just wanting to get as far away as possible. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled onto the main trail. I stopped to catch my breath, my chest heaving, my legs shaking. I looked around, half expecting to see that figure standing somewhere in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the empty trail and the darkening forest around me. I forced myself to keep moving, walking quickly but not running, trying to stay calm. I kept looking over my shoulder, my nerves on edge. Every little sound made me jump, every rustling leaf or snapping twig. I felt like I was being watched, followed, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. When I finally made it back to the parking lot, I practically sprinted to my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the ignition. I took a deep breath, started the car, and drove out of there as fast as I could. I didn't open that box until I got home. It took me a while to find a tool small enough to pick the lock, but when I finally got it open, all that was inside was a small piece of paper. I unfolded it and my heart skipped a beat. Written on it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Don't look back." I don't know what was out there in those woods, and I don't want to know. I've told a few people about what happened, but most of them just laugh it off or say I was imagining things. Maybe I was, but I know what I felt, and whatever it was real enough to make me think twice before going hiking alone again. Now, whenever I'm out on a trail, I can't shake the feeling that there's something out there, watching, waiting, and I never ever look back. Alright, so let me tell you about this hike I went on last year. It was supposed to be just a regular, chill day out in nature. I usually go hiking with a couple of friends, but this time I decided to go solo. Needed some time alone to clear my head, you know? Anyway, I picked this trail in a national park about an hour's drive from my place. It wasn't super popular, which I liked, because I was looking for some peace and quiet. I got there pretty early in the morning, around 7 a.m. There were a few cars in the parking lot, but not many. The air was crisp, and the forest was still waking up. I grabbed my backpack, made sure I had enough water and snacks, and set off. The trail started off pretty easy, a nice flat path through the woods with the occasional uphill stretch, perfect for just zoning out and enjoying the scenery. About an hour into the hike, I started to notice the trail getting steeper and a bit more rugged. Nothing crazy, but enough to make me pay more attention to where I was stepping. The trees were getting denser too, with less sunlight filtering through the canopy. It was one of those moments where you're just fully immersed in nature, and it feels like the rest of the world doesn't exist. I kept going, and eventually, the trail opened up into a small clearing. It was nice, with a fallen log that made for a perfect spot to sit and take a break. So, I took off my backpack, sat down, and pulled out a granola bar. While I was sitting there, I noticed something weird. Off to the side of the clearing, there was this faint, overgrown path leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't on the map I had, and it definitely didn't look like part of the main trail. But being the curious person I am, I decided to check it out. The path was narrow and almost completely covered by bushes and low-hanging branches. I had to duck and weave my way through, brushing off cobwebs and pushing aside branches. The further I went, the more I realized this path hadn't been used in a long time. The trees were so close together that it felt like they were closing in on me, and the sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy above. After about 10 minutes of walking, I came across something unexpected. It was an old, dilapidated cabin. I don't know how else to describe it. It looked like something out of a horror movie. The wood was rotting, the windows were shattered, and the door was hanging off its hinges. It was just sitting there, in the middle of nowhere, like it had been forgotten by time. Now, a sane person would probably have turned around and gone back to the main trail at this point. But no, not me. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. I mean, what could go wrong, right? I walked up to the cabin, my footsteps crunching on the overgrown path. As I got closer, I could see that the door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. There was this weird smell in the air, like damp wood mixed with something metallic. It made my stomach churn, but I pushed that feeling aside. I gave the door a gentle push, and it creaked open, revealing the dark interior of the cabin. It was pitch black inside, and I couldn't see much, so I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small, cramped space. There was a table in the middle of the room, an old, rusted stove in the corner, and a rickety bed against the far wall. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and it looked like no one had been in there for years. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air was thick and musty, making it hard to breathe. I slowly made my way to the table in the center of the room. There were some old, faded papers scattered on top of it, but nothing that seemed important. Then I noticed something on the floor next to the bed, a small, leather-bound journal. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Most of it was blank, but there were a few entries written in shaky handwriting. They didn't make much sense, just random thoughts and scribbles. One entry, though, caught my attention. It read, "They're out there, watching. I can feel them. I can't leave, not yet. Not until I know it's safe. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. Suddenly, being in that cabin didn't feel like such a good idea anymore. I shoved the journal into my backpack, figuring I'd take a closer look at it later. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something outside. It was this faint rustling sound, like something moving through the bushes. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the cabin. I held my breath, trying to make out what it was. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. A deer or something. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from right outside the door. My blood ran cold. That was not a deer. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The cabin was the only shelter around, but the idea of staying in there with whatever was outside made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath and decided to make a run for it. Staying inside felt like a trap. I slowly crept to the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The growling had stopped, but I knew whatever it was still out there. I pushed the door open just enough to peek outside. The forest was dead silent, and I couldn't see anything moving. I took another deep breath, then bolted out the door, running as fast as I could down the overgrown path. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I ran, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that cabin, away from whatever was out there. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my legs were burning, but I kept going. I had to. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled back onto the main trail. I stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around. There was no sign of whatever had been outside the cabin. It was just me and the forest, quiet and still. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself down, to convince myself that it was over. But then I heard it again, that rustling sound, coming from the trees behind me. I turned around, and for a split second, I saw it, a shadowy figure, moving between the trees. It was big, bigger than any animal I'd seen before, and it was moving towards me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I took off running again, heading back towards the parking lot. My lungs were on fire, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I pushed through the pain. I needed to get out of there. Finally, I burst out of the woods and into the parking lot. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys, and jumped in. I locked the doors, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. I drove for miles, not stopping until I was back in the city. I pulled into a gas station and parked, my hands still shaking. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I took the journal out of my backpack and stared at it, the words echoing in my mind. They're out there, watching. I don't know what I saw out there that day. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal, but deep down, I know it wasn't something I could explain. I haven't gone hiking alone since then. I still go with friends sometimes, but I always stick to the well-known trails now. No more off-the-beaten-path adventures for me. That cabin, that journal, and whatever was out there in the woods, they still haunt me. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still hear that growling sound in my head, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run when I did. I've thought about going back to that trail, to see if I can find the cabin again, but every time I think about it, I get this sinking feeling in my gut, like it's not over, like it's waiting for me to come back, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Some things are better left alone.